there's something about actual genre or form that the letters of Paul are written in, that is their letters from Paul and Timothy and Silvanus or whomever, but to you, plural. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take much. It's a kind of easy trick of the eye for a reader to sort of put themselves in the role of the addressee of the letter. We know they weren't originally addressed to us, but it's not that hard to pretend, right, that you're just being spoken directly to. In a way, that's true of all scripture, is that religious communities, so Christians with the Christian Bible, read it often as addressed to them in the present and not just to the ancient audiences. With Paul, it's easier not to do that, right? It's easier to sort of let the words wash over you as if he were speaking directly to you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Matthew Novenson. Matt is professor of biblical criticism and biblical antiquities at the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland. I've known Matt for quite a few years now. He's a really, really great guy, really generous scholar, wonderful human being, all the wonderful adjectives we could add on. He has written a number of really important books. His first published dissertation, Christ Among the Messiahs, award-winning book, really, really fantastic book. And then his second book, The Grammar of Messianism, also another really important book. Anybody who's taken classes from me before in the past on Messianism will know Matt's name really well because I reference him a lot. He was really formative for me in my own research and writing on Davidic Messianism in the Gospel of Mark. So really value his scholarship. Today we're actually talking about his work on Paul, his most recent book, although he's got another Paul book coming out, which he mentions in the episode. But the book we're talking about today is Paul Then and Now. Really excellent collection of essays, gets at Pauline studies from a variety of different angles. It does get a bit nerdy at times, but if you are into biblical studies, you're into Paul in particular, this is the kind of stuff you want to be reading. He's got a lot of great conversations, engaging different questions from different angles, pushing back against dichotomies that are unhelpful. And so I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation, and I highly encourage you to get the book if you're into scholarship and into Pauline studies. Before we dive into the episode, just want to encourage you again to make sure that you are liking the episode. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to us or follow us on whatever platform you're using. If it's on the YouTube channel, please make sure you're subscribing. If you're listening to us on podcasts, you can do so either through subscription or following and writing us a review. That would be awesome. I want to continue to mention that we are welcoming people to become members of the Center for Bible Study. This is an awesome opportunity for you to make a recurring tax-deductible donation to the Center for Bible Study of whatever dollar amount you choose. That qualifies you for membership. And your membership gains you entrance into all future Center for Bible Study classes, gains you access to all past Center for Bible Study classes, the recordings, the notes, the PowerPoints. You're also helping to support us in our online endeavors to provide high quality biblical content like this episode. And we'll also give you a shout out to say thanks, as well as a monthly newsletter. So you get a lot of really great stuff. You're part of an awesome community, and you're able to help out this ministry as we continue on. So want to encourage you to consider that. There's a link in the description. You can follow that to become a member for the Center for Bible Study. And we would very, very much appreciate your help there. And with that, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Matt Novenson. Well, welcome everybody back to the podcast. I am super excited today to be joined by a friend and a really incredible colleague, Dr. Matthew Novenson. We're going to be talking about his book today, Paul Then and Now. Fantastic book. Really excited to dive into it. Matt, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to chat with you in this format, Max. So thank you.
Normally it's been in person at a pub in the past, so that's just right. A different format. But if I can, I just want to share one story about Matt, just because I think it illustrates just what a charitable scholar and excellent guy he is. So when I was working on my PhD, I was floundering for the first couple of years, and I don't know if you can attest to this, Matt, is supervising PhD students, especially in the UK, when you just dive into things, oftentimes it takes a little while to figure out what the heck you're doing. And it took me most of my time actually in St. Andrews to figure out exactly what I was doing. And so it was a couple years into trying to write the dissertation, and I came across Matt's book, which I'd been wanting to read for a while, but I wasn't sure exactly what I was writing on. So my birthday was coming up. And at this point in my marriage, my wife knows all this guy wants is books anyway, so just let him order a book, whatever. And so I'm like, all right, well, I really want to get this book, Christ Among the Messiahs. So I got the book, I started reading it, couldn't put it down, and everything in my mind in terms of what I'd been thinking about and Christology and Messianism just like sort of clicked. And I realized in an instant kind of what I wanted to do for my dissertation. And that began really for me just a great opportunity to chat with Matt and form a relationship there. And he had been so gracious with me. He was working on his second book, The Grammar of Messianism, which also was really formative in my thinking. And he even shared with me, many conversations, but even a pre-publication chapter that was, again, really formative to my thinking. So, Matt, I really appreciate your scholarship a lot. That's a long way of saying that, and appreciate the way that you model just generosity to younger scholars who are trying to figure out what we're doing in the world. So thank you.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. And I just to get us started, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. Actually, this is new to me. I don't think we've ever talked about this. How did you get into biblical studies? I'd love to hear just a little bit about that, and then maybe also what motivates you to do the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, I got into biblical studies. I dabbled in it as an undergraduate, and then dabbled a little deeper as a master's student, and then eventually as a PhD student, sort of jumped in the deep end. I had in my undergraduate, I started as an English major and changed to philosophy, actually, and then I added a sort of theology and religion as a second. I ended up double majoring in philosophy and then also theology, but not really biblical studies. Although I did start both Greek and Hebrew in that undergrad degree. So, and that was probably the kind of gateway drug, I think, is languages.
The languages?
Right? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, probably. And then I did a generalist theology master's degree, and during which I realized, you notice when you're the one person who really loves the language courses and other people are sort of just can't wait for them to be over with.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of for me, that was a litmus test. Like, okay, I'm into this and into a certain aspect of this in a way that other people aren't. So maybe that means that I should look really closely at this. So then I did a THM and PhD, sort of all in New Testament, and I was like, yeah, that's where I found my the thing I most love to do.
Was there ever a moment for you, or was it kind of just more of like a progressive thing, like try this, oh, this is kind of cool, what's the next step sort of thing? Or did you have like a moment where you were like, wow, this is really great, I would love to spend my life being a scholar?
Yeah, no, I can't think of no one like conversion story moment,
Yeah.
Seeing the light of and coming to biblical studies. No, it was probably a process like that, but I was wandering. I knew I wanted to do humanities, and then I knew I was interested in kind of philosophy and religion kind of things, and then it just sort of kept inching that way. And you figured out that those I was and remained really interested in philosophical and theological questions. Biblical studies lets you it's just different. It unsettles things because you're reading in a different language context than your own, and you're asking not just constructive or normative questions, but historical ones and textual ones, which means, I don't know, it's set up so as to get outside your own head a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
maybe something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in ways connected to like what I talk about in this book that we're discussing
Right.
about,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking about some of these questions about God and the universe and so on, but thinking about how other people thought them, who thought about them very differently from how
Mm-hmm.
I or other moderns do.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just kind of really took a shine to that and have managed to keep doing it for a while now.
Yeah. Yeah. And what motivates you most now to do the work that you do? I mean, you've done obviously a lot of really important formative work on messianism, and in my mind, kind of helped reframe some of the conversation, or at least provide other avenues forward, other than just, hey, what were models of messianism or something like that. But also with your work on Paul, but very much historically focused um, in your scholarship. What drives you as a scholar today?
Two main things come to mind, I guess. I mean, one is just a love of and interest in the subject matter. Like I may someday tire of it, but I haven't yet.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I kind of consider myself very lucky to get up each day and like work on the next sort of question related to all this.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, I have what feels like a bottomless interest in the subject matter, although I may reach the bottom sometime. But it's just
Yeah, it's endlessly
uh,
fascinating. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And then I love working with students. It's the other. I enjoy it when a research leave comes around and you have sort of 6 months just to work on a project, but much more than that. And I think I really miss the classroom setting and just, well, it again has to do with getting out of your own head,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you when you teach as well as research, there's always kind of new inputs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Students at all levels, but graduate students especially, like see things that you as a teacher haven't seen yet, and sometimes undergraduates too. And that makes it easy to sort of get up and go to work. The idea that
Yeah.
because every new uh, class session is I mean, I get to see them learn new things, some of which I already know, but also I learn new things that I went into the room not expecting that I would learn. So I really, working
Yeah.
with students is one of the main things that gets me up in the morning.
That's cool. Well, and I'll say, if anybody's looking to do a PhD in the UK, this is a guy you definitely want to consider studying with if you're in for that kind of thing. You have an awesome experience. Um, okay, I'd love to dive into the book, and I think this kind of gets at the general tenor of a lot of what you're doing in the book, which is to really just kind of raise the question of why it's so challenging for modern scholars to actually read Paul on his own terms. You quote Robert Morgan, I think, if I was counting, almost in every chapter, either in the chapter or in a footnote. And this is the quotation: "In saying what Christianity was for Paul, they are often saying what it is for them." So this kind of easy shift between making what is ostensibly a historical claim, but it always seems to be more than that. And some of what you're getting at in the book also is, I think, trying to say, hey, can we actually keep these two things separate so that the historical piece can actually be just historical? But yeah, so what makes it so challenging? First off, what's the deal with Paul? Why is this guy so tough?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you've put your finger on, I think, what is the key problem in the book. And there's several essential parts to an answer to that question, I think. One of them that a few of the essays are devoted to there is um, something congenital in Protestantism, I think. And I say this, and I write about this in the book as
Mm-hmm.
I mean, critical, but as an insider. I mean, I'm born and raised Protestant myself, so I get why it happens. But part of the book looks at actually kind of the history of interpretation, especially from the 16th century to the present. And I think it's not an accident that, well, if institutionally and bibliographically, right, most Pauline studies, I mean, if you just sort of count books on a bookshelf, tends to come from institutionally Protestant spaces and has for hundreds of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I argue in here that that's not accidental. That, I mean, Martin Luther was more forthright than most in saying, he had a canon within a canon and was willing to name it. And
Yeah.
to the extent that he made Paul his patron saint, I think there's something about the exigencies of church history that it's not an accident that it's in Protestant spaces, historically Protestant spaces, where the study of Paul especially tends to flourish, and resources are directed to it, and so on. So there's something there, and I talk too about if it's how very different an experience it can be to read a number of really fascinating books on Paul written by Roman Catholic scholars or Jewish scholars or atheist scholars, because they don't relate to the primary text in the same way.
They don't seem as obsessed with Romans and Galatians either, right? Is another thing you pointed out.
Yeah.
It's a lot of Protestant scholarship. We can think about somebody like Bauer or whatever, but so focused on Romans and Galatians is like the substructure of Paul's theology. And you point out, you look at some church fathers, particularly before Augustine. It wasn't an inevitability that Romans would be the summa of Paul's theology at that point in the church's life. And even today, if someone doesn't have quite the same vested interest, it seems like they're willing to read Paul in different ways. It doesn't require a Romans Galatians nucleus.
That's we are all creatures in part of all the influences that bear down upon us, but one of those I think is the history of religions, the history of Christianity, especially in the study of canonical Christian texts, and the study of Paul, especially in the history of Protestantism. And I diagnose it as a critic, but I'm also an insider to it. Like I know, I can feel what it feels like for Protestant interpreters who have that kind of compulsion. And the other main thing, in answer to the question, why does this happen with Paul, is I think this is true. I was discussing this with Morwenna Ludlow, a great patrist from Exeter in the UK, and she made this point, which on reflection, I think is right, that there's something about, the actual genre or form that the letters of Paul are written in, that is their letters from Paul and Timothy and Silvanus or whomever, but to you, plural. Mm-hmm. And sort of, it doesn't take much. It's a kind of easy trick of the eye for a reader to sort of put themselves in the role of the addressee of the letter. We know they weren't originally addressed to us, but it's not that hard to pretend, right, that you're just being spoken directly to. And that in a way, that's true of all scripture, is that religious communities, so Christians with the Christian Bible, read it often as addressed to them in the present and not just to the ancient audiences. But if you compare, compare a lot of sayings of Jesus in the Gospels where there's a narrative frame that says, he said this to the scribes, right? Or he said this to Mary and Martha, or he said this to so-and-so. And then you have to do an additional step of relating yourself to the scribes or to Mary and Martha or whomever. But with Paul, it's easier not to do that, right? It's easier to sort of let the words wash over you as if he were speaking directly to you. And I think there's something to that dynamic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I talk about that with students basically every semester when we talk about biblical interpretation. Is there's something about Paul's letters in particular that we forget that we're not the addressees of the letters in a way that we don't do that with any other part of the canon. If we're reading that as Christian scripture. And I think it has to do with probably has to do with the history that you discuss in the book. It probably has something to do, and I don't know if this is as true in the UK where you teach. There's probably truth to it, but certainly in American evangelicalism, the context that I'm kind of embedded in my role here is, Paul has often been, there's a desire to make the Bible into a series of, propositional statements or commands or whatever. And I think there's something about Paul's letters in a way that you don't have necessarily with the Gospels, because narrative is a little bit more difficult to do. This kind of easy movement into commands, like or just basic propositional statements. So I wonder if that's part of it as well. I think in a context too where people want the Bible to give them really black and white answers to a lot of questions. It's Paul's letters are not necessarily in fact, but at least in appearance, maybe more conducive to that kind of a reading strategy than, say, the Gospels or other parts of the Bible. And so I think that's probably part of it too. I want to ask you about this question. So when we think about Pauline studies, it's typical to kind of go through the various schools, right? The Lutheran Paul, or whatever you want to call him, the New Perspective Paul, the apocalyptic Pauline school, and then, of course, the Paul within Judaism school. Just had Matt Thiessen on a little while ago, so we got to talk about his book, A Jewish Paul. And so he's a great kind of representative of that. But one of the things that I was really chewing on with your book is that sometimes I wonder if we're like, those schools can be tribal, but there's another sense in which I think the field could be kind of construed. And this is something that I felt when I was reading your book. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this. I was wondering if maybe there's kind of three tribes, not necessarily equally represented, because maybe you have some that get way more play and have traditionally, but different ways of thinking about how Paul should be studied and read. One would be the Paul with theology, right? So if we think about like great names like Tom Wright, John Barclay, you quoted John as saying Paul's language is irreducibly theological, and you kind of probed what he means by that. Then there's the sort of Paul without theology school, like we need to get theology out of Pauline studies. You mentioned Stanley Stowers as one representative of that. There's others as well. And then there's maybe even I was looking for a name. The first two I kind of took from your book, but the third one I was thinking like Paul beyond historical criticism, or Paul even beyond any kind of historical redescription project. So like the problem with the discipline is that historical criticism has reigned, and now we need to sort of annex that and just read Paul in different ways. So these are very different competing reading strategies, ideological projects, and I'd love for you to just kind of speak into that issue a little bit, and how you think your book, what you're trying to do in your book, how your book intervenes into that conversation, because Pauline studies, it strikes me as being a very tribal discipline. I'm not sure if there's any discipline in biblical studies that's quite so tribal as Pauline studies, and maybe again that goes back to it seems like the most is at stake in how we read Paul, so that might be part of the explanation to that. But anyway, anything you'd like to share kind of about that, and your kind of assessment of the lay of the land, and what you're trying to do in the book in order to kind of speak to the context.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, and I think some version of that kind of way of slicing up the field probably has some legs to it. I mean, I certainly think, we do well to not to just think in the ruts of sort of what the introductions or handbooks tell us, right? That there are precisely 4 ways of reading Paul. You could be Lutheran, New Perspective, or apocalyptic, or whatever. That's not the case, right? Every such rubric is an imposition. It's an attempt to organize the discussion in some way, and so certainly no one should rule the day. And it's the case that, I mean, those labels, especially Lutheran, New Perspective, apocalyptic, are all very inner Christian, and in fact inner Protestant again, right? I mean, all of the that is a very important recent history of research, and from each of those scholars from within each of those, who fly each of those flags, I've learned a great deal. So I have sort of books or articles within each of them that I like better than others and so on. But it's interesting that, right, all of the leading lights and all those are, it's a kind of inner Protestant discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't even question the sort of close nexus between Paul and constructive Christian theology. Whereas the way you've just divided it up about Paul with theology, Paul without theology, Paul beyond historical criticism and so on, is a more, well, it takes a wider view. And I mean, it actually encompasses more of the scholarship, and it also sort of dares to to question that, you know, not just decades, but centuries old sort of marriage between Paul and constructive Christian theology, especially Protestant. So, I mean, the field nowadays is far more diverse, religiously, ethnically, gender-wise, and so on than it used to be. You know, I mean, if you go into certain SBL rooms, it still can look pretty homogenous, but relative to what it has been. And so I think it is important if you're, for our own sakes, as if you're a researcher, or certainly if you're describing it to students, not to talk about the field as if it is still just, you know, a very small kind of in-house debate amongst certain kinds of Protestants. So for that reason, I think the way you introduced it there is quite helpful. Stowers is a great example because he just really boldly kind of called a spade, I mean, right, and says that the study of Paul has been crypto-theological in all kinds of ways, and it's possible to read it otherwise. And then he says, "Watch me do it," right? With his book on Romans, which is a really remarkable book for that reason, partly because
rereading Romans, for those who haven't read it, that is one of the I think most important books written on Romans. Would you agree, Matt? I think it's just such an important book. They had a review panel of it, was it a year or two ago at the SBL, and you know, I mean, people agree, disagree with parts of Stowers, but it's unquestionably an incredible piece of scholarship, and agree or disagree with it, it will expand your horizons when you're reading Romans in a number of really wonderful ways.
Yeah, and then that, I mean, so the kind of third option you mentioned, I mean, Lara Nasrallah illustrates this really well. It's similarly a kind of radical questioning of the roots of the discipline, but in a different direction from what Stowers does, right? So Nasrallah, Eleni Johnson de Beaufry also is really interesting on this, right? I mean, they both would have interests that are more theological than Stowers does, maybe, but they're actually questioning the extent to which historical criticism is, as its hegemony has been, you know, to the harm of readers.
Other questions you might ask of Paul, right?
Yeah. So anyway, I don't generally try. I don't in the book, and I'm not inclined to, in general, kind of try to organize the field in that kind of way, just because what I'm kind of chasing the outer edges, the things that aren't included in the, you know, kind of traditional potted histories of the field. And to that extent, I mean, this book it's maybe a little bit Pollyannish this way, but it tries to avoid tribalism. It tries to say, well, you know, I'll never convince everyone of anything in particular, but I can say, you know, up front, I have an interest in and a sympathy with aspects of a lot of these readings, and I'm not interested in shutting down avenues of inquiry. I'm interested in opening it up, and so the book tries to. I mean, I'm sure the book, well, for those who bother to read it, it might alienate some people, but it tries to kind of open the field up and get interesting readings and observations from some of these different schools or whatever to talk to each other a little bit, at least within the mind of the author, and then hopefully for the readers.
Yeah, no, I think that comes across in the book. I don't think it's hard for me to imagine it would alienate anybody. I think it does a really nice job of trying to ask questions from different angles and create bridges and possibility for further conversation. I think it is with the field of Pauline studies being as tribal as it is. I do think at some level it is actually it works against the betterment of the field as a whole, because I think any discipline is more likely to advance when conversations, especially across ideological lines, are actually happening and people are open to new ideas and fresh ideas. And it's just unfortunate. And I mean, it's wonderful in that it is more diverse now probably than it has ever been. And as you say, it should still be much more diverse. But we need to actually be having the conversations. So I appreciate that the book's trying to do that. And yeah, as I was thinking of these different categories, I was thinking more along the lines of, it seems to me like if I was imagining conversations in my mind's eye, someone like a Tom Wright might really disagree with, someone like Beverly Gaventa, but they would both probably be able to have a conversation because they're after theological ends in quite often when they're reading the text. Whereas I know Tom, if he's thinking about other scholars that, are trying to get past that, for him, that would probably be a non-starter. Right. And so in some ways, as I was thinking about these categories, it's almost like these are sort of more, I think, ideological, epistemological commitments that people have. And it's just a question of like, to what extent others are open to having dialogue with people that fall outside of their camp and what end they think the Bible should be used for. So, okay. So you asked the question in one of your chapters, one of my favorite chapters in the book, did Paul abandon either Judaism or monotheism? And I love the answer. I'm going to pull a quote out from end of page 54 on to page 55. I think this is one of the best succinct answers I've ever heard to the question. So I'll read it for the audience and then I'll let you speak into it however you want. But you write that the comparison is not between Judaism and Christianity, the latter concept being not yet available to Paul, but between Jewish piety in the present evil age and Jewish mythology about the perfect age to come, or in other words, between everyday Judaism and eschatological Judaism. So would you be willing to unpack for us a little bit of what you're saying there in that quotation?
Yeah, that sentence or two, in a way, it was an attempt to respond to this debate about, especially the Paul within Judaism discussion, right? Where for a lot of scholars, quite rightly, I think, it's obviously, but also importantly true that Paul, not just before his revelation, but for his entire life, operates within the ambit of Judaism. But then some critics of that discussion have said, well, but what about all these things he says that seem to them like defeaters for that claim, right?
Like the kind of radical newness, sort of that kind of language. Yeah.
So critics of the Paul within Judaism discussion will say, but how then can Paul say, through the law, I died to the law so that I might live to God? Or how can he say, to the Jews, I become like a Jew, right? As if he's not always one, right? Or how can he say that, the covenant with Moses written on tablets in letters deals death, or something like that? That two critics of the Paul within Judaism discussion will often cite those texts, which is an important move, right? And say, well, if he was within Judaism in the way that a lot of other scholars want to affirm, he wouldn't be able to say those things. Mm-hmm. And I think they're getting at something. The critics are getting at something when they point to some of those texts, mm-hmm. because there's some interpreters, again, under a broadly Paul within Judaism label, who want to be able to say just
nothing changed, basically.
Nothing changed. Paul affirms the status quo ante for Jews. He has issues with Gentiles and them taking on the law of Moses and so on. But as for Jews and Judaism, he affirms the status quo ante. And I think that is not true. And some so critics are right when they kind of smell that's not true, that something's wrong with that. But I think they're usually wrong in what they affirm when they throw those texts from Paul around, because when they throw those texts from Paul around, I think they're often saying, aha, see, he vindicates Christianity. Mm-hmm. And that's also not true, mm-hmm. in my view. So part of what I do briefly in this book, and what I have been working on at much more length recently, is trying to show how some of these famously Christianizing or antinomian sounding texts in Paul also fit in the history of Judaism, in particular in the history of Jewish eschatology and mysticism, this kind of the history of Jewish speculation about, well, what happens when the resurrection of the dead comes, and what happens when the new creation comes. And turns out, there's lots of really interesting, sometimes rather bold and daring and even antinomian, even more antinomian than Paul, sort of statements in ancient and medieval Jewish literature, rabbinic and mystical and otherwise, in which I think these sayings of Paul make really good sense. And the reception history of Paul, of course, is almost entirely Christian. So,
right.
With Christian hindsight, we look at those verses and say, oh, he's affirming what Christians have come to say. But to my mind, the one genius observation at the heart of the Paul within Judaism discussion that really ought never to go away is that, well, when Paul said those things, he didn't yet mean them in the institutionally Christian way. He meant them in a way, he had to have meant them in a way that was intelligible to him as a early Roman period Jew.
Right.
And I think you can really powerfully make that case from the history of Jewish thought in antiquity and the Middle Ages around these issues. So that's what I was trying to get at with this distinction. It's not between Judaism and Christianity, but between sort of conventional quotidian Jewish piety and then Jewish
eschatological
mysticism or eschatology.
Yeah. And so statements like, that people would point to also his kind of credentials that he lists in Philippians 3 of having a righteousness of my own versus the righteousness that's in Christ. This is not a denigration in any way of the Torah, but that the eschatological righteousness that comes with Christ, that's kind of like would you say like the ultimate aim to which one would aspire? So now that's come, that obviously is going to take on the ultimate significance. Is that would that be a fair thing to say?
I think I would agree with the way you put it there. Yeah, it's that. So the difference between Paul and most Christians ever, and most Jews ever too, is that he literally thought the resurrection of the dead was happening because Jesus had just been raised from the dead, right? And so to talk about a kind of righteousness in the law and sort of conventional observance of the commandments, and then a kind of righteousness that exists after the resurrection of the dead, that's a well-attested distinction, again, in a broad swath of Jewish literature, in apocalypses that are older than Paul, and certainly in rabbinic discussion, which comes after Paul, but which is independent of Paul. So I think the key thing is that interpreters often think when they read something like Philippians 3, when he talks about a righteousness from Christ's faith that's not the righteousness of the law, that's just Christianity he's describing. But historically in his context, it's not. He's talking about the kind of righteousness that didn't exist in the world prior to the resurrection of the dead, and that now is, I think that, I have ended up arguing that Christian interpretation of Paul actually ends up deflating what I think Paul means by a lot of these terms, because they have to kind of make it coincide with polite Christian piety, which in his context, it's not.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And so the kind of statements that you listed at the beginning about law and what Paul says about the law, one place then where what you're arguing, it seems to me, maybe going beyond, or at least a wrinkle on what maybe some others, Matt Thiessen, I think, is probably more kind of where you're at, but where some others in the Paul within Judaism school have gone is the Paul's statements about the law in these kind of polemical letters, like a Galatians, the observation that these are made to Gentiles about the law, that I think is true on its face. But the implications of what those statements, what Paul's saying in those statements, would also bear on himself and other Jews if, in fact, the resurrection of the dead has come about. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's right. So I think, with I agree with like Pamela Eisenbaum or Kathy Ahrensberger and so on, who've said you have to take into account that in a very Paul's letters are addressed more or less entirely to Gentiles, and so that's a relevant factor for the interpretation of any of them. That taking that into account does resolve a number of problems, but not all the problems. And one of the ones it doesn't resolve, in my view, is this. Yeah, there are. So when, for instance, in Galatians 3, he talks about the curse of the law, that, some Paul within Judaism interpreters have wanted to say, oh, that just means when Gentiles use it the wrong way, then it becomes a curse, right? And I think that's not the case. I think here I'm influenced a bit by one of your former classmates, a friend of both of ours, Esau Macaulay. His PhD thesis on Galatians had a good discussion of this, which kind of helped me sort it out in my mind. The curse of the law, I think, is death. It's the fact of death, and death afflicts Jews as well as Gentiles. And what Paul thought that most Jews and Gentiles then and now didn't think and don't think is that you could actually not, like, the prospect of not dying was real to him, right? And yeah, so the point is, the curse of the law is not just, I don't think plausibly you can't just say, oh, that means when Gentiles do it wrong. He thinks that the law of Moses legislated for mortal people, which it does, right? But when Paul talks about life everlasting, aionios zoe, that is a kind of life that doesn't end in death. And so there's a kind of righteousness for that life that is different from what Moses wrote about, because Moses wrote about people who, of course, die. Right? So that showed that, yeah, that's an example of one of these, what I think is kind of some of the outer limits of this discussion.
Yeah, super helpful. No, I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I think, was it Andrew Boyachi? He wrote also about this as well, right?
He has his book on Galatians is excellent on this, and that his book also made a penny drop for me. So Boyachi shows how righteousness gets correlated with life in Galatians, and sin or unrighteousness with death, and coming to see how the language of death and life it's not like metaphorical for, like, a good kind of religion versus a bad kind of religion. Like, it literally means the fact of mortality. And Paul, living in the immediate aftermath of the resurrection of Jesus, like that's what he's talking about. So it's not, and this is why, this is why I say it's not about Judaism versus Christianity, about two different sort of patterns of religion, because he's actually talking about immortality in a way that not just Jews, but Christians don't seriously reckon with most of the time.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yep. Yeah, there's a question that Paul asks that it clicked for me a little bit, that when Paul's asking questions like, can the law make you alive, or claiming that it can't make you alive, that he's not talking metaphorically. Like, he's actually saying nothing wrong with the Torah, but it cannot raise you from the dead. Only the Spirit can. And that seems to be an important point he wants to make. Well, we did get into a little bit of the audience question of Paul's letters, and that leads me to another thing you write about in the book, which is, speaking into, I think one of your essays was originally published in the so-called Jew. What was the title of
Yeah.
that book? Rafael Rodriguez and Matthew Thiessen book.
Yeah.
The
The
so-called
book is
Jew.
called The So-Called Jew in Romans 2,
Yeah, something like
or
that.
in
Okay.
Paul's letter to the Romans.
Something
I
like that,
forget.
right? Yeah, great book. But you have a chapter in there, and that's published in here, and so there's been a lot of discussion for those who maybe haven't been keeping up with everything Paul. No fault of yours. There's a lot always going on. But there's been a lot of discussion, especially, I think, driven within the Paul within Judaism school. Although, as you point out in the book, it's not really an inevitability that this would have to be the case. It just so happens that this is how it has turned out. But a lot of conversation about the ethnic identity of Paul's interlocutor in Romans 2, this person that he's speaking to, emerges in very first verse of chapter 2. Who are you, good sir, to judge? So who's this judgy person? And then we get in verse 17, if you call yourself a Jew. So what's at stake in this debate in terms of identifying the identity of the interlocutor? I don't think there's ever been so much debate over the identity of a fictive interlocutor in any text before, at least that I know of. So what's at stake in this question of who this person is, and how do you seek to contribute to the conversation?
I think what's at stake in this debate, and you're right, it's a kind of, you might think it's a tempest in a teapot, or maybe it's just a tempest. I don't. But you're right. It's a huge debate around kind of a pretty small exegetical issue, relatively speaking. But because the letter to the Romans, and especially the very early chapters of the letter to the Romans, are sort of the locus classicus for a lot of traditional doctrines, Christian doctrines, especially in Western, so Roman Catholic and Protestant theologies, of sin and salvation. Yeah, and this was Stanley Stowers' sort of brilliant insight in his rereading of Romans book, that the weight of theological tradition sort of lies really heavy on the interpretation of these chapters. Mm-hmm. And, a very common way the story goes is by the time you get to Romans 3:20, Paul has sort of universally condemned everyone. Mm-hmm. And so that in 3:21 and following, you have Paul's declaration of salvation for everyone. So very universalizing, and a kind of an assumption about how the early chapters of Romans work this way, right? Mm-hmm. That it's condemning, and then an announcement of salvation. And the usual way that series of condemnations is read is to say, well, there's a few different ways it's done. Some say he's just condemning everybody all the time from the start. Mm-hmm. Or the other common way it's done is to say that in Romans chapter 1, he maybe starts by condemning Gentiles who are wantonly immoral. And then in chapter 2, he condemns Jews who are not wantonly immoral, but maybe think they're better than others, but aren't really, or something like that. So the argument, which appears here and there in the long history of interpretation, but it really, the most important living proponent of this idea was Runar Thorsteinsson, the Icelandic scholar who wrote a book on this in the very early aughts, right, turn of the millennium, arguing that when Paul says, if you call yourself or are called a Jew, that he actually means someone who sort of has the name but not the thing, mm-hmm. that it's about a Gentile posing as a Jew or proselytizing to Judaism or something like that. And I argue with a number of others that the revisionist reading is correct, that actually in Romans 2:17 and following, he's talking about Gentile Judaizing and not about Jews or Israel as such. But that's really controversial and has stirred a lot of debate, I think, because Romans 1-3 is such a kind of mixing metaphors horribly here, but it's such a kind of sacred cow to so many Christian, especially Protestant interpreters. I try to argue that actually could have lowering the temperature, de-theologizing the debate a bit is helpful, because I think a lot of a lot of the things that some of the fiercest defenders of a more traditional reading want, actually, you could still, and I still do, end up affirming in a rather different way. But I think you actually miss something then that I think is real significant about the letter if you don't grasp the point that, as I read it, he is talking in Romans 2, as he talks through all of Galatians and also a bit in Philippians, about this phenomenon, which was a real problem for him, of Gentiles undergoing proselyte circumcision because they think they needed it to be right with God and Christ. I think it's no accident and no surprise that it should show up in Romans 2. It just means then that the rhetoric, the argument of Romans 1, 2, and 3 work differently than you might think from most of the standard commentaries and so on.
Yeah, and so just for people that are, if you're really dialed into Romans and you're wondering, okay, so how does Matt then put this together if it's all about Gentiles? Your argument is that when you get into chapter 3, I think it's like 3:9, is it, where Paul does make a statement about Jews as well. He basically has this catena of scripture quotations to show, hey, within our sacred text traditions, they condemn us to an extent as well, right? And it's not an anti-Jewish thing to say. I mean, you have prayers of confession of corporate sin, and hey, we've fallen, we've broken covenant with the Lord, and so for Paul to pull that out, that's not it's not an anti-Jewish claim in any sense. He's just showing from Scripture that the Scriptures speak directly to the Jewish people as well. But your point is basically that's not the main feature in Romans 1 and 2. Romans 1 and 2 is doing something other than condemning everybody collectively, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think that Paul means what he says when he ends up saying in chapter 3 that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. But I think that Paul thinks, in a way different from what most of us nowadays would say, he thinks that he has a kind of ethnically chauvinist kind of view of this. He thinks that Gentiles are just bad people.
Right.
Right. And he thinks that Jews are not perfect, but they're normally good people. Right. Now, all of them, he'll say, are under sin. But the way I understand the argument of Romans 3 to work is that he says he knows that Jews are subject to sin because Scripture says so. So he knows it from Scripture. Whereas he knows that Gentiles are sinful from experience, from the
just looking at the world. Yeah, they all worship idols and live these profligate lifestyles.
He does not even, I think, he doesn't even entertain the notion of like the righteous Gentile you might run into and go, oh, how did he manage to be so virtuous? Philo, speculates about how that could be the case. Paul does not. Paul doesn't think there are any such, unless and until they receive the pneuma, the Spirit of God, which sort of remakes them from the inside.
Yeah. And then you also have, part of your argument is also looking at not only what he says about the so-called Jew earlier on in the letter, but what he says about actual Jews in Romans 9 through 11. So how do you connect that?
Yeah, so Romans 2 talks about the one who is called or calls himself a Jew. Romans 9 through 11 talks mostly about Israel. I think, and again, all of this stuff, of course, is controversial. I think that Israel and the Jews denominates more or less the same group of people for Paul.
So you don't follow like Jason Staples' argument in?
No, well, I think Staples' argument in his book about the idea of Israel is right that I think there are some Hellenistic and Roman period writers who distinguish Israel from Jews or Judeans as kind of part from whole, right? 12 tribes versus one tribe or whatever. I don't see that distinction in Paul. So yeah, that's where I disagree with Staples' argument about Paul. But what Paul faults Israel with in Romans 9 to 11 is not sort of anything like what he says in chapter 2, in Romans chapter 2, about, not practicing what you preach and so on. What he faults Israel for in Romans 9 through 11 is not trusting the announcement of Jesus, the crucified Messiah, because Paul knows what was in fact the case, that most Jews in his day did not believe that Jesus was the crucified, that Jesus was the Messiah. Mm-hmm. And that's what Paul faults them with, quote unquote, in Romans 9 through 11. And I think that's so different from Romans 2 that I think that's part of my reason for thinking that Romans 2 is about a Gentile Judaizer and not sort of Paul's assessment of his co-ethnics.
Yeah. Have you speculated much on this too? I've often wondered this when we're thinking about the missionary movement that Paul's fighting against in Galatians, Romans, Philippians. Who do you had a cryptic statement in one of your I think it was when you were commenting on Philippians in one of your essays, but the identity of this group, are these Jewish Christ followers, missionaries, like people from, Paul mentions in Galatians 2, people from the men from James came up from Jerusalem to Antioch or whatever. I think the standard line is that we assume there were some, and then maybe from Acts 15 also there's the mention of the Pharisees, the Christ following Pharisees who want to have Gentiles circumcised or whatever. But we don't actually get the identity of this group ever in Paul's letters. He mentions them as agitators in Galatians. Do you have any thoughts on like what the logic of this group might have been, or who you think they might have been? It seems to me like, if I'm reading between the lines incorrectly, but some of what you might be suggesting is something that I've speculated a lot about, which is that these might have been actually proselytes, Christ followers who are Jewish proselytes.
Yeah. Yes, I do have thoughts. And I've got a book manuscript that's just gone off to press that makes this argument among a number of other arguments, but it's about there's a chapter of the book that argues at great length that you can identify maybe at least, but probably, and maybe just two main groups of quote unquote opponents in Paul's letters. Ones who we know are Jewish, the evidence for whom is in 2 Corinthians, chapters 10 to 13, the so-called super apostles or false apostles, and so on. We know they're Jewish because he says so again and again. They're Israelites, they're Hebrews, they're sons of Abraham, and so on. And then in Galatians especially, also in Philippians and a little bit in Romans, there's this idea of people who come preaching circumcision. And I think, without exception, every passage about such people in Paul suggests that they are recent proselytes themselves.
Ah.
It was a bit fuzzy to me before I started working on it, and then I sort of worked through all these texts, and I said, I don't think I don't think it's ambiguous at all. So that argument will be forthcoming. But no, I think
that's fantastic. I look forward to reading that. I've been saying that to students in class for years now, but I always qualify it with saying, hey, this is my speculation on it. I haven't done the research. So I'm excited to see what you've got. That's cool.
Yeah, read it when it comes out. I mean, it's a minority view. So again, that won't, I really think that's the case. The idea was associated with the name of Johannes Munk, especially as Danish scholar from Aarhus in the mid 20th century. And he made this argument in Galatians and made a few really powerful points. And I kind of looked at his arguments and then looked at, others have talked about this possibility too. But yes, so I think that's the case. I think that the people advocating proselyte circumcision that Paul's reckoning with are themselves recent proselytes.
Wow, very cool. Is that going to be in your new Paul book, or do you have a separate article that's coming out?
Yes, no, there's a new Paul book out this time next year, probably.
Awesome.
That will have that argument in it.
All right. Well, may have to have you back on the podcast to talk about it. That's cool. Okay, one more question for you before we cut you loose. So you mentioned already, Paul. The One of these statements used as kind of a defeater for the Paul of the Judaism school. When I became as a Jew to Jews, as a Gentile to Gentiles, this kind of language in 1 Corinthians 9:20. Obviously, rhetorically, Paul is using this as a kind of model of seeking the good of the other and trying to get the Corinthians to get out of their doing the opposite of that, selfishness or whatever. But that brings up, there's a lot of inferences people make in terms of like what is Paul doing there? Can Paul's halakhic practices change based on context? I think we can see that they can potentially. So I'd just like to hear you kind of unpack what you think he means by that. What does it mean to live, among Gentiles? And maybe even could you connect that to what he says to Peter when they're in Antioch, living gentilishly to Peter? Because I know so many people that read that naturally. I think most Christians, when they read that, they think, oh, Peter wasn't following the law anymore. Peter was done with the law now at this point, but then he goes back to it because men from James come up. So what is Paul talking about there?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, I think in 1 Corinthians 9, the point rhetorically is he's saying, I accommodate others, so you all should too, right? That's the reason. That's the occasion for that passage. And there he presents it as a virtue. I mean, it's, of course, interesting aspect of the reception history of that passage. Kevin Concannon has discussed this, that passage has often been read by some ancient critics of Christianity as showing that Paul is like not to be trusted, right? He lacks integrity.
He's two-faced, yeah.
He's two-faced. Yeah. He's a con man or something, and he tells you that.
Yeah, right? That's funny.
Which just the point there is just that the value judgment is a secondary thing to the way he presents itself. What would you think of someone who changed who they were in different circumstances? Mm-hmm. Anyway, I think I think he means it sincerely, and I think his kind of theological rationale for it is that the way Paul, as I understand it, the way he thinks to himself that he can sort of, cross ethnic lines like this, is that he thinks he's a pneumatic. That is, that he has a kind of existence because he has the pneuma or spirit of God that's remade him. This is what Albert Schweitzer called in his book on Paul, the resurrection mode of existence, that he kind of lives the life of an angel or something almost, that he's beyond the merely human. I think that's the kind of probably the theological idea I think Paul has behind his kind of but of course elsewhere, right, like Philippians 3, Paul insists that he sure as hell is a Jew, right? A Hebrew, right, circumcised and so on. So like both of these are true, right? And I think the way I synthesize it and from what Paul himself says is I think he thinks that to the extent that he or other people still have mortal bodies, that's his term in Romans 6 and 8, mortal bodies come in two types, Jewish and not. Mm-hmm. And the commandments of God, there are different sets of commandments of God that pertain to Jewish bodies and Gentile bodies. And to the extent that you're still in a mortal body, you're accountable to those commandments. But if you have the pneuma of God inside you, you're actually you've partly transcended mortal existence that comes in kind of sexed and ethnic binary kinds of bodies. So I think this is why Paul thinks that he can kind of
adapt his lifestyle.
But in fact, also socially, there's a really good book forthcoming from Ruben Buhner, someone you and I both know, whose his habilitation at Zurich was on this question of diaspora Jewish halakha or legal thinking. And he argues in a way I find really persuasive that, probably Paul and Cephas in Antioch, right? If you're accustomed to moving about in the diaspora, there's all kinds of concessions and accommodations that you're just used to making that
Mm-hmm.
that you wouldn't count as violating the Torah or living an
Mm-hmm.
antinomian existence. Like you would consider it being observant in the way that you can be living in the kind of city you do or alongside
Mm-hmm.
the kind of people you do.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of piety in the nature of the case will often be very different from the kind of piety that you can observe in the homeland, where you can assume that everybody else is also kind of keeping similar observances and so on. And so Buhner argues that a lot of the concrete moves Paul made probably were things that diaspora Jews did all the time
Mm-hmm.
in antiquity, and that somebody might call living Gentilishly.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they were thinking they were sort of violating the law. They were
Mm-hmm.
living the law the way you can if you live in a Gentile city or something.
That's cool.
But that the theological layer on top of that is that Paul thinks he's doing it because he has this he has the prerogatives of a pneumatic, of someone who is living beyond the confines of normal human existence, whether Jewish or Gentile.
That's cool. Oh, that's awesome. I'm actually having Ruben on the podcast too in a little bit. We're going to be talking about high messianism, but
oh, good,
yeah,
good,
he
good, good.
He shared with me his project a couple years ago at SBL, and I thought it was really fascinating. So that's awesome that he's coming out with a book. I think that's really fantastic. Yeah, I was even thinking, as you were talking about, even a text like the letter of Aristeas, like what are the implications of Jewish scribes coming from Jerusalem to dine with the pagan king in Egypt? What would that dinner look like? And what were how would that even be? Would that put one in a precarious position potentially, right? And so it's interesting. Like even in a text like that, you have these really pious Jewish scribes from Jerusalem, priests who are coming down and just having this meal with this Ptolemaic king, and it's all of the philosophical conversation about the law, and I don't know, it's just it's kind of all there in the text. So I'm really interested to see what Ruben has to say. All right, can I sneak in one really quick, one more? It's kind of a meta question that I want to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Having read the book and just processing everything, and I'm not sure. I generally just kind of want to know what your thinking on this is. So it's not in any way a pushback on the book. The impression that I got after reading the book would be that clearly theology can be an obstacle to reading Paul historically. But I was also wondering, like, is there actually any, like, we obviously all have to read Paul from somewhere, and the ideal of reading him historically on his own terms, I think is admirable. I mean, it's, if we're claiming to provide a historical reading of an author, then we should be doing such. But I'm just wondering if within modern scholarship, I do think sometimes there is an ideal when it comes to getting theology out, that points to some kind of pristine historical reading. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, yeah, how do you think about it at the end of the day? Like, if we get theology out, what kind of, like, what would an ideal place to approach Paul historically look like, I guess? Does that make sense? I know I'm fumbling around here a little bit, but I'm just trying to identify, like, what would put somebody in the best possible position to read Paul well historically.
Oh, what was in the best possible position? Yeah, I mean, just a bit of self-awareness, self-criticism, just the ability to say whatever other interests I may have, which are maybe in theory entirely worthy and appropriate, and there's no problem with them. At the moment, I'm interested in how did this mean in the 50s CE. That's all it is. It's just I mean, you mentioned there, echoing the kind of a very apt criticism like of Lara Nasrallah, that historical criticism can kind of claim to a kind of pristine view from nowhere, right? Sort of, and I think with yours, what I took to be a sort of note of skepticism from you there, and in agreement with like what Nasrallah is on record as saying, right? There is, I think, there is no view from nowhere. There's in fact no such thing, I would want to say, as objectivity, in as much as we always read from our own subjectivities, and that's just part of being human. That's fine.
Yeah.
And for some of us, our subjectivities will include like actual theological questions. I mean, and I have those. I mean, I happen to be a Christian reader. Other brilliant readers of Paul, some of them are not. And so they don't have maybe constructive theological interests in the letters of Paul the way Christian readers like me would. But I also, and here's where I maybe differ a bit from my other, my own co-religionists, some of them readers of Paul, in that I want to say, but the fact that I have theological interests in the letters doesn't mean that I can only ever ask this one kind of question about them, right? Because I have all kinds of, I have historical interests. I have kind of feminist or other ethical interests, and I have all kinds of interests, and relatedly then all kinds of questions I might want to ask of the text. And so I don't have any objectivity because I'm always operating from my own subjectivity, but I can ask different kinds of questions, and to that extent read the letters differently, looking to know different things. And part of my point about what I call hermeneutical relativism in the book is I don't think you actually have to read historically before you can go on and do anything else. Like if you want to do a Roman Catholic theological reading of Romans 14, or if you want to do a sort of a gender queer reading of Galatians 3 or whatever, you're like, go for it. Like you don't have to do historical criticism first. But I also think that, what we sometimes call historical criticism, if suitably sort of chastened, is, just another word for asking questions about the past, which we sometimes might have good reason to do, even though there are lots of other questions, not about the past, that we might have equal or better reason to do. And I just wanted to carve out space for people to feel free to read in those different ways. I think
it's good.
For the most part, that's a net good. So
yeah, no, I'm totally with you. Yeah, I just want to hear more about that. Do you feel like when you look at so I'm thinking like back to the statement of making Paul weird again. I mean, it's funny to kind of end there. I was almost thinking, I was trying to think about this a little bit in terms of like how some historical Jesus research has gone in the past. Like if Jesus looks too Christian, that can't be the historical Jesus. Do you feel like that sometimes with Paul? Like if Paul comes off looking too Christian, that can't be the historical Paul, or too Christian in the ways that he's looked. I don't know. That was a little bit of the sense that I got in the book. I may have overreading it. But
yeah, kind of. I mean, I wouldn't say it can't be the historical Paul then, right? There may indeed be. There probably are some cases where the two might line up. But I think it's like an occupational hazard, right? That's why, I mean, you should. So the cover of the book has, and chapter 1 discusses, right? There's this famous painting by Rembrandt, which is called his self-portrait as the Apostle Paul, where which is just an amazing thing, right? I mean, he paints himself as Paul and Rembrandt at the same time. And that I kind of use as an image for how the interpretation of Paul often goes. It doesn't mean that Rembrandt and Paul didn't have some actual things in genuine common or something, but I'm this kind of collapsing between then and now, or between me, the reader, and Paul, the writer, is that's the occupational hazard I'm trying to flag up and say. So it's not that readings like that might not sometimes happen on the historical Paul, but that methodologically you should be on the lookout.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Matt, for your time. Awesome book, everybody. Really great scholarship. It's so well written, as always, with a Matt Novenson book. But it's a really enjoyable read, really insightful. So if you're into Pauline studies and you're looking for fresh angles into questions that people are asking right now in the discipline, this is a really great book to dive in. And Matt does a great job of introducing you to some of the primary voices in the conversation, and highly, highly recommended it. Thanks, Matt, for your time.
That's great. Thanks, Max, for reading it and discussing it with me.
Awesome. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.